All right, everyone. We are going to button up the rest of this section here with a lecture around Exchange Hybrid. Now, Exchange Hybrid fits lots of different scenarios, but we need to really kind of take a step back, and we're just going to really talk about this here. We're going to look at some diagrams and do some thought crafting. It's way too difficult, unfortunately, in a class like this here to lab out. We need a full Exchange environment. We need SSL certificates, public IP addresses. It's just a lot of different things we need. So let's jump into it here and just start talking about the Exchange Hybrid environment, what it is, what the purpose of it is, and so on. So let's start off with, what is it? Really, when it comes down to it, what is an Exchange Hybrid organization, or a hybrid Exchange organization? I guess either or will work. But what is the purpose of it, and why do we care about it? Well, looking at it here, it's a way to extend our on-premise Exchange organization to Exchange Online. Now, it's important to understand that we're looking at extending, okay? So we are taking our on-premises organization and extending it to Exchange Online so we can use both, hence the name hybrid. We're able to utilize both. And why do we care, or what's the purpose of it? Well, this allows for a mostly, and I use mostly in quotations there because it is mostly seamless, but there are some caveats which really dive down into the technicalities, which we'll talk about, of course, but we're not going to dive into. But it is a mostly seamless transition for end users and a rich coexistence. That's a big important piece here. We actually have two separate and unique organizations that we are actually going to make look like they are part of the same. When you think about it, that seems very easy, but on the back end, that's actually an incredibly complex thing that's going on. And Microsoft has done a great job on this over the years. I've done probably over 1,000 of these in my career of migrations to Exchange Online, and this is always how we do it. Now, there are some instances we have to do it a different way, but for the most part, this is typically how we do it. Now, I'm going to use more of an easy or a typical type environment, what we would normally see. These generally in the field, they could be varied so much. But let's look at it here. So I have this diagram I've been playing around with here a little bit. Right now, this is essentially how we have our Active Directory set up inside of our lab environment. I have PocketSquareProfessor.live, which you can see over here, is the Active Directory. We have Azure Active Directory Sync, which is synchronizing our stuff to Azure AD. And that's really it. Now, we do not have an Exchange environment, but let me show you here. This is just a typical one. I have a 3-node DAG in the same data center. So we just have a data center, and you can see here's the firewall. Here's the network here, so this is essentially our part of the network. On the other side there, this is the demarcation point. On the other side there is the internet and everything else that exists out there. So we have in our data center here just a logical piece here. We have inside of this yellowy, orangey, salmony color here, we have 3 Exchange 2016 mailbox servers. Why did I pick Exchange 2016? Well, honestly, it's probably one of the most popular ones out there because A, it's still supported, and B, there's a big difference, and I know we talked about this in the beginning here, but there's a difference between Exchange 2016 and 2019 in terms of recommended requirements. Exchange 2016 requires you can get by with 8 gigabytes of RAM for a minimum, we'll say a minimum build for a server, which you never would in a very big environment, but you can get by with it in a hybrid environment. But what will end up happening is in Exchange 2019, there was a big change, and this is where Microsoft essentially drew the line in the sand. If you look up the requirements for an Exchange 2019 server, 128 gigabytes of RAM per server. So we're talking big numbers. That's a ton of RAM. So why would we care, and why did Microsoft jack up the RAM so much? Well, for many reasons, but the biggest reason here is to say that, okay, well, we're making Exchange 2019 and all Exchange on-premise going forward for our customers who want to stay on-premise, okay? But those are going to be traditionally our very large customers, very enterprise grade. We're talking lots and lots and lots of users. To them, 128 gigabytes of RAM for a server is not out of the norm. But for our mom and pop shops, the medlar, if you will, where they have 3 Exchange servers like you see on here, or 5, or even maybe like 10, it makes sense to move it to Exchange Online. there is really no reason to be on-premise anymore unless it really comes down to the fact of, hey, I just don't trust it. That's a very popular thing I'm seeing nowadays here. It just requires a lot of help from our end to be able to instruct and instill the trust of all of the security features that you get. And I'll be honest with you here too. Exchange Online, comparatively speaking, compared to on-premise, is more secure. Just inherently, the things that you can do in Exchange Online with the Azure Active Directory, we looked at all the security pieces there, around multi-factor authentication, all of those things there. You can't even do that. I mean, those things on premise would require another third party, it would require more configuration. And here's the best part about it. My on-premise environment goes down for whatever reason. I have to wake up early in the morning, whatever, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I got to make sure that it gets back up. Whereas in Exchange Online, I don't have to worry about that. That is somebody else's responsibility to make sure it's up and running. So, with all that being said, here's a typical environment we have. We have 3, we'll just forget about this side over here on the left. We'll just look at it as it stands right now. What do we have? We have this red dotted line, which is, as we look down here, we have web services. So this is going to be Outlook Anywhere. This is going to be OWA, or Outlook on the web. And this is going to be ActiveSync. This is also going to be EWS, Auto Discover, everything that we talked about during our client access piece here. This is pretty much everything going to be on this one because it's all over port 443. It's going to come down here and you can see, and I do have a hardware load balancer here. This is one of the more common scenarios I'll see. I don't typically see one without one too frequently anymore if we have multiple, because we want to use this hardware load balancer to balance it out between these 3 servers. So essentially, this server or this hardware load balancer is balancing out that 443 connection between these 3. And it's saying that, okay, well, if one of them goes down or is not responding on port 443, it's going to take it out of the pool and it will no longer send traffic to it. So it's a smart hardware load balancer. So at that point there, we have this coming from the internet coming in and hitting it here. We would have all internal network traffic would all hit to this one here because they would be on this side of the firewall and the blue area. All of that would hit the hardware load balancer and do the exact same thing. So depending on the route, if they're coming from the internet coming in, or if they're on this side of the firewall, they're going to hit the hardware load balancer and be directed to the Exchange servers. So regardless, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. They're going to be directed towards these Exchange servers in some form or fashion. Great. We have mail flow through send connectors. Remember, we have set through send connectors. Send connectors are going to be our green one here, which says outbound mail flow over port 25. We're going to include all 3 of these servers here in the send connector, and all 3 of these here are going to be able to send out. Exchange natively has load balancing capabilities inside of the application itself, so we can just send out directly here. We don't have to go through the load balancer if we don't want. We also have this blue one, which is the internet traffic coming in. So this is going to be SMTP traffic from the internet coming in, inbound mail over port 25. Now I have it here just going to the DAG just to represent. 9 times out of 10 it will actually follow this same instance here of hitting this hardware load balancer and doing that exact same thing, but instead of for port 443 we'll do port 25. So that instance there, that is a common scenario, and I just have it set up here to point to it just to logically represent this is the way that the traffic's flowing. This is a pretty typical environment, okay? This is really nothing that's out of the norm. Now you notice if you're looking at the legend down here, there's some things that we're missing. So we want to make our environment hybrid. So right now, as it stands, this is the way we are. How can we make this a hybrid environment? Well, we have to do a couple of things, but the main thing that we have to use is something called the Hybrid Configuration Wizard. Now, this is actually a tool that Microsoft has, and it has come a long way. I remember running it in Exchange 2010, and it used to be very much an art where you would run it, something would fail, you would get a very generic error on it, and you would literally change nothing at all, run it again, and then it would get past it. So that's the way it used to be. It was pretty funny, but really it has come quite a long ways, and it's actually much more of a science now, where it's actually relatively straightforward and very easy to run. So at that point there, we run this hybrid configuration wizard. Okay, so we typically think of a wizard as like an exe or in its own application. Well, that's not the case, okay? And just so we're aware as we go through, we're going to make our Exchange organization hybrid. There are a lot of references and a lot of discussions around the idea of a hybrid server. So when we're looking at Exchange Server roles, one of those roles, we did not see hybrid because there is no such thing as a hybrid server. There is such thing as an Exchange hybrid organization. Our organization is hybrid, not an individual server. There are no roles for it. All of our roles, as you see on here, are all going to be mailbox server roles. So just an FYI. So again, we're going to take this hybrid configuration wizard, we're going to run it. It's going to modify our organization, and it's going to add lots of different things. So let's look at if we start adding in the Exchange Online piece or the Office 365 piece. So here is the piece around Office 365, and we notice our graph here got a little bit more colorful. So traffic is still coming into Exchange. We have run the hybrid configuration wizard. It has done many things. We'll talk about those as it goes, but one of the biggest things is we'll see these two dotted lines. We have a black dotted line here and we have a purple dotted line. Why did I pick those colors? No idea. They just are there. That's just what I picked. I don't know. I was playing around with Visio and they looked fine. So we have one coming inbound and one going outbound, and they are both labeled. We have inbound hybrid mail and we have outbound hybrid mail, and we'll see it's scoped to a very specific domain name. We'll get to that here in just a second. But let's look at it here. So when we run that hybrid configuration wizard, we're making changes to the organization as a whole. So now the organization will actually have many different things. One thing is we're going to change the default email address policy. So we're going to change and we're going to add to every mailbox in the organization is going to get a proxy address. This proxy address is going to be your username at this. Now in this instance I used the lab we've been playing around with here. This is my tenant name, PSP Alloway. Remember, that's what I created up in Office 365. And yours will obviously be whatever yours is. So I did PSP Alloway, that's fine, but it's going to be .mail.onmicrosoft.com. This is what's referred to as a remote routing address. I'll explain this a little bit further as we go through, but I just want to show you that that's one of the first things that the hybrid wizard does, is it changes the every user in the organization gets a remote routing address attached to them. And that's all. It doesn't change the primary SMTP address, nothing like that. It just changes the remote routing address. Great. The other thing that it does is it creates a send connector from on-premise. So typically before, if I wanted to send outbound to the internet, I'll have a star scoped send connector. Remember, we talked about that during the mail flow scenario here, and that would be this green one here. That would go out to the internet and deliver to the recipients. Well, one of the things that it would do here is create a send connector that is scoped specifically for this domain. For, in this instance, again, mine's going to be pspalloway.mail.onmicrosoft.com. It's going to be scoped specifically for that domain. So what that means is we're going to have two ways of sending to the internet. One way is going to be using this, which is the MX record, which is going to use star. So literally if I send it to Google, Gmail, whatever, it's going to go out through this scope. But if I need to send a piece of mail to user at pspalloway.mail.onmicrosoft.com, it's going to use this special scoped connector here, which is going to go directly and be configured to go directly to Exchange Online, to our Exchange Online instance. So it's a direct connection from our on-premise to Exchange Online. Now this is all over port 25, as you can see here. So again, mail flow goes this way. Okay. So again, in this instance here, we have mail flow, Exchange Online. We will actually configure during the hybrid configuration wizard as well, so it can send on-premise. And we can see through this dotted line, black dotted line, we have inbound hybrid mail. So again, if I'm on Office 365 and I need to send to somebody on-premise, it's going to go this direction. But if I'm in Office 365 and I need to send outbound to the internet, I'm going to go through this connection, which goes directly outbound to the internet. Now again, this is a common scenario here. This is not the only scenario. There are tons of scenarios here, and especially around the idea of outbound mail flow. Maybe we have a third-party appliance like a Mimecast or a Proofpoint or something like that. That is a antivirus, anti-spam appliance. Maybe we are doing some sort of service like that, and that exists here outside of the internet, but all of our mail flow will hit it first and then go outbound. Well, that's fine. We can have in here in Office 365, we can configure that to go to the Mimecast or the Proofpoints or the whatevers and then go out to the internet too. But you'll notice that we only have outbound mail flow going to Exchange Online. What about inbound mail flow? Well, let's talk about this here. So the way this works out, and we're going to reference this chart here many times, but the way this works out is I have all of my users exist down here as user mailboxes. When I migrate them and I set up a migration batch, So I'm going to set up a migration, and we're going to talk about how the migration effort works. It's going to go and seed my mailbox up to Exchange Online. Okay, and then when I cut it over, I will have a mailbox that exists in Exchange Online. And that's fine. So I have user A up here, and then the rest of my users down here. So user B wants to send an email to user A down here. So remember, user B is down here on premise. So I'm going to send an email to user A, and it is going to go to, so in here we have to look at, when we're talking about Exchange, this Exchange organization here, before I used to be just a user mailbox, okay? I would actually have a mailbox that would get delivered on premise. Well, that doesn't work anymore because we can't have a user mailbox on premise here, because if it gets delivered on premise, it's not going to go up to Office 365. So what we actually do is we get rid of our mailbox on premise when we migrate a user. Okay, so user A gets migrated, user A mailbox goes away, and that user A gets converted to what's referred to as a remote recipient. That remote recipient has a remote routing address attached to it. So again, in this instance here, I'm going to see a recipient on premise for user A that is user A at, and again, I'm just going to use this example, pspalloway.mail.onmicrosoft.com. So that is the address. So when Exchange gets a piece of mail destined for that user, it's going to forward it to that domain. So remember, we created this special send connector here where it's going to automatically send it through this special scope connector, which will deliver the mail up to Office 365 or Exchange Online. So it's going to go directly to the user's mailbox up here in Exchange Online, and the user here will just send it, and it goes outbound and it gets delivered. It is seamless to the end users. So again, remember, we have set up several different things here. The hybrid configuration, we're going to talk more about what the hybrid configuration wizard does and more things that it does, because there's a lot. But the mail flow itself, the same exact scenario happens in Office 365. User A wants to send a piece of mail to user B. Okay, so user A goes and types in user A goes in and types in user B's email address. Well, how do we know all of the mailboxes that are down here, how are they up here? Well, guess what? We have this guy right here, this Azure AD Connect server that's synchronizing all of our mail attributes up there as well. So everybody who has not been migrated to Exchange Online, you will see everybody who has been migrated, our user mailbox is up here now, remote mailbox is down here, but everybody who has not been migrated are mail-enabled contacts up here, and mail users or mailboxes down here. So the idea here is that inside of Office 365, when I look at my GAL or my global address list, I'm going to have an exact copy of what's down here. And as things change, the Azure AD Connect server will synchronize those changes so they get converted to either mailboxes or mail-enabled users up there. So at that point, what are they? Well, it depends on where they are in the migration effort and everything, but we are keeping a synchronized GAL. This is called that rich coexistence, okay? And if they were to send a piece of mail to it, it would come same exact scenario here. User A is up here, send it to user B. It would go through the scope send connector, be delivered on premise. The users would be completely unaware of what happens with it. The mail flow is working back and forth and everything's fine. Now, same exact scenario is no matter where you're at, and it's all based off of your context. So again, user A has been migrated to Exchange Online. As far as Office 365 and Exchange Online is concerned, that is a user mailbox. As far as your on-premise organization is concerned for user A, you are a remote recipient. Same concept applies here for user B. User B on-premise here is a user mailbox. User B in Office 365 is a mail-enabled user or a remote recipient up there as well. So it knows how to essentially send mail flow back and forth to each other. So we're keeping the same thing. We have an exact identical global address list, and we also have the ability to send mail flow specifically. We don't have to send our mail flow out to the internet and be filtered through our spam appliances and everything. That's not a bad idea. That is a bad practice. That is actually not supported as well. A little bit complicated on why it's not supported. It essentially strips away an internal header and it views it as an external message, which then traditionally will get marked as spam or junk or whatever. Of course, we don't want that to happen, so we don't do that. All right, looking at this mail flow diagram, there's a lot going on here, but let's talk a little bit further of how the hybrid configuration wizard changes the organization, and also what does the migration effort look like. So let's start off with, first and foremost, how do we migrate our users? So users are migrated via online mailbox migrations. Now, the important word here is online, okay? So in this instance here, 95%, so we do a two-phased migration status here, okay? So we kick off the migration batch. It starts seeding that mailbox up in Exchange Online, okay? And it's putting all of this data. Meanwhile, the user on premise is still actively working in their mailbox. They're still able to connect to their mailbox, send, receive, do everything that they do. They're completely unaware. That's why it's an online mailbox move. So we are passively seeding the copy up in Exchange Online. And then it will get to a point where we get to that 95% and it will be moved to a sync status. So it says that, all right, we are synced. We're ready to finish. So once we go in, and this could be done during the day, it is completely, the users are completely oblivious to it. They have no idea what's going on. Easy enough there, and we can set that up whenever and start that migration effort whenever we want. So then when we hit that sync status, we can finalize the mailbox. So the additional 5% of the mail is going to be migrated, as well as the Active Directory changes. So those Active Directory changes are removing that mailbox on premise and changing it to a remote recipient user, and then essentially saying that, hey, this is no longer an on-premise mailbox, it is a cloud mailbox. So all of that happens in the back end there, and we don't have to touch anything. It's really all GUI based here. You could, of course, do this through PowerShell or scripting methods. That's perfectly fine. But it's really pretty easy nowadays, is that we set up the batch. It'll let you know, hey, your user is now in a sync status, ready to finish. And then generally what we do here, and I would say 99 out of 100 times, is we would do a migration. We would finish the migration after hours, because the finalization of the mailbox will kick the user out of their mailbox. So we do that off hours. We only have to transfer 5% of the mail, so the time that they are down, and I'm using that in quotations, is very minimal. So we can still do this off hours, like 9, 10 o'clock at night. We finalize it, we let it do its thing, and it's all, we just click the button, make sure it starts the finalization process, and then honestly we walk away and it's good. There are a couple other little caveats we have to do, of course, but it's really not for the scope of what we're discussing here. Online mailbox migrations make life so much easier for an Exchange administrator, and this is what makes it a graceful transition to Exchange Online. We can do this in rolling aspects. We can do departments at a time, user groups, whatever we want. Any kind of logical units, we can do that as a slow roll till we get everybody in the cloud, and it's the least impactful to the end user. After the mailbox has been moved, we talked about this already, but it becomes a remote mailbox after the migration. So mailboxes become remote mailboxes. When again, the name implies is remote, that it's in a different area. Then the AD Connect synchronizes users to form a unified GAL. So as I said, the big piece of this here is that we have a unified GAL because the AD Connect server is synchronizing all of the changes. Once user A gets migrated to Exchange Online, they get changed in Active Directory and Exchange, and then the AD Connect server goes back around and says, okay, we're going to flip them from an on-premise mailbox to a remote, and then in the cloud we're going to change this from a remote to on-prem, but we'll just say a user mailbox. So it flips them. So easy enough there from that. What else do we do? What about the mail flow? Well, we talked a little bit about this here. So once a user is migrated, they become a remote user mailbox and have a remote routing address attached to their object. So we talked about this already, is that when the hybrid configuration wizard runs, it changes the email address policy, which applies a remote routing address. So right now I have my email address, again, is malloway@pocketsquareprofessor.live, which I still have on premise. And even if I do get changed over to a remote routing address, my primary doesn't change. My primary email address, it doesn't change. The only thing that changes is now we get this remote routing address attached to my mailbox that it says basically if Exchange gets a piece of mail, forward it to this address here. This will go through that scope send connector, be delivered up in Exchange Online. So the remote routing address is important because this is all about SMTP routing. As we said here, the hybrid configuration wizard creates a send connector scoped explicitly for, now I said PSP Alloway, but again, it's whatever the name of the tenant is. It's not going to be PSP Alloway, it's going to be whatever. So whatever yours is, there you substitute your tenant name for it, and it'll send it directly to Exchange Online. All right, so we talked about mail flow. We talked about migration process. Now, users are working in two distinct locations, user A and user B. Now, one of the things that we talked about during the client access part is, and this is probably one of the most important parts here, this is something that users just, they really, really need, and that's around the idea of web services. And what I mean by web services are going to be one in particular is going to be free busy. Remember when we looked at, hey, are you busy? Are you not busy? Well, if that's broken while a user is in the cloud and we have it between the two, if that's broken, we're going to have a terrible user experience. The users themselves are not going to have a good experience because they're not going to be able to schedule meetings, and that just completely breaks the system there. It's completely useless. So what we do is Exchange Web Services takes, this is one piece of this, and honestly almost everything is done through Exchange Web Services here, as well as the migrations, migration endpoints, as well as the FreeBusy. So FreeBusy works between Exchange Online and on-premise Exchange through an organization relationship and federation trust. So what we're saying here is that this is another configuration that the hybrid configuration wizard does and changes, is that it says, okay, well, we trust Exchange Online to be able to share our FreeBusy too. And then it goes up to Exchange Online. It says Exchange Online trusts our on-premise organization to share FreeBusy as well. So we can go through FreeBusy as a whole, and then we create what's referred to as a federation trust. And those relationships there are created, but the federation trust is essentially a security method that allows us to be able to say that, you know, A trusts B and B trusts A, and this is how we're secure. This is how we know and verify that A is A and B is B. So that's done. The hybrid configuration takes care of all of that. We don't have to change that at all. And then, as I said, the mailbox migrations are handled through the EWS endpoint as well. So Exchange Web Services is a virtual directory that exists inside of the Exchange thing. This is what FreeBusy uses. And Exchange Web Services also handles what something is called the MRS proxy, which is the mailbox replication service. So when mailboxes are migrated and we are passively seeding them, we are using, essentially in this instance, port 443 to initiate that conversation. It's going to be done through port 443, and we're going to send all of those mailbox, that data, if you will, the passive copies up to Exchange Online and downwards too. So remember, we can go bidirectional. If we need to move somebody from on-premise back down, or excuse me, somebody in Exchange Online back down to on-premise, we can do that as well. It's bidirectional. However, most of the time we're always going up to try and get everybody off of our on-premise system. But all right, so we talked about web services here. Now, again, like I said, it works. This is that rich coexistence that I talked about here. We have FreeBusy working between the two. Now, I will be 100% honest with you. The FreeBusy is probably one of the most notoriously difficult things to get working in a hybrid server and a hybrid system or a hybrid organization, because it is just a very finicky web service, and there's just a lot of problems with it. So I have a whole system of things that I do, and Microsoft actually has an entire FreeBusy troubleshooter, this whole giant catalog of, here, try this, try this, try this, try this, and it gets very complicated. FreeBusy is one of the things that just, it irks me to no end, because it's so important to the end user, but it's so annoying to work with. So it is what it is. So web services are, all right, now we see that mailbox migrations are pretty seamless for the users. The FreeBusy piece works as well. So we're able to essentially mirror what we have on premise. So those are two great pieces of this. Well, what about client access? Well, what happens with, I'm in Outlook? All right, so one day I'm in Outlook, and then I get an email that day saying, hey, you're going to be migrated tonight. You come in the next morning, you open up Outlook, and you're working in the new environment. That's how it works. Well, for the most part, anyway. But the biggest piece of this overall is auto-discover. This is the lifeblood that runs this client configuration process. So auto-discover, it is what is telling you that you are no longer on-premise. You need to connect to Exchange Online service endpoints. So once you have become a remote mailbox, you're going to hit Exchange on-premise, as you always do. We looked up the auto-discover request, remember that? And in this instance here, we went directly to Exchange Online. But if we were on-premise, we would be hitting on-premise endpoints. And after I've been migrated, I would go to it and connect back to the server, and the server would say, you're no longer here, here's where you need to connect, and it would redirect you to the Exchange Online web service URLs. You would connect up there, and your mailbox will switch over. Now, the user profile that exists with Outlook, usually, I use that in quotations because I would say usually it does, that it will automatically switch over, meaning that we do not have to do a local OST sync. So that cache file that is located on the on-premise. Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about the difference between cache versus non-cache mode in Outlook, because honestly, having online mode or non-cache mode, that's just not a good recommendation anymore, especially with Exchange Online. Microsoft recommends you use the cached mode. But again, using a local OST that already exists on the machine itself, we don't have to resync it. We don't have to pull all that mail down again. All of it just basically reconfigures the profile. Again, Auto Discover will take care of all of this. So once it reconfigures the profile, again, the experience is, and I would say for the vast majority of the time, the experience for the end user is, I am working one night in Outlook, I'm connected to on-premise Exchange, then I get an email that says, hey, we're going to migrate you tonight at 10 o'clock. Well, 10 o'clock comes around, I get kicked out of my mailbox, I go to bed, I come in the next morning, I get a little alert on my Outlook account that says the Exchange administrator has made a change to your account. Close out of it, close out of Outlook altogether, open it back up. I get redirected to Exchange Online, and my mailbox will automatically connect there. And that's really it. That is the intended experience. I can't tell you that's the same experience that happens every time. The reason being is I have a lot of customers, especially in the past, that did not have a healthy auto discover. So they would do a lot of monkeying around with group policies to make manual changes to the client configuration process, and that breaks auto discover. And at that point they're not going to automatically migrate over. You have to change those group policies and everything. It's not ideal. So I generally don't recommend using group policies for the auto discover process. It's not a good idea. Let it run natively and let it run the way it's supposed to run for this to work fully. There's one thing that I've said that, remember I said it's usually seamless and it usually switches over. So I use those kind of buzzwords there because, again, I've done so many of these here that I've run into it all. There are scenarios here that just don't work very well. For instance, when we're looking at mailbox delegation, let's just say on-premise we have user A and user B. User A has access to user B's mailbox in some form. Let's just say that they have, send as. Well, what we can do is that when we migrate the two, when we migrate user A, that delegation there are two types of delegation, and that's send as well as full access. Those will transmit across the forest, if you will, the boundaries. Meaning that if user A has full access to user B on premise, user A gets migrated. User A can still have full access to the mailbox on premise that they did before in terms of that delegation access. So we looked at that already. But if for whatever reason they have send on behalf, or again, some of these the other ones that are calendar delegations that I see the most is saying that, so-and-so only has access to, you have reviewer access to my calendar or whatever. Those do not migrate well. So when they're split between the two, we have user A and user B. That calendar delegation is broken for the period of time until user B is migrated up into the cloud, at which point there you'll have access again. You don't have to reconfigure anything. It'll automatically start working again. So we have to look at that from a delegation standpoint. That's just one thing to look at because it's just one of the way that the delegation works there and how it connects and everything like that is that it just doesn't work across the boundary. And really the boundary is the internet. So Exchange Online cannot come back down on premise here under this circumstance because of just security reasons is the big piece, but also a way that the client connects. Just is what it is. Shared mailboxes and everything, those work as long as they have full access. So that auto mapping feature there, that again, remember when we logged in with the Outlook account and we showed that it had a mailbox that was attached to it, that will still work. And it works much better once everybody's in the cloud. But I always stress to my customers here is that as we go through this migration effort, it's kind of a mess because, again, at the end of the day, when you're in a more mature Exchange organization, everybody has access to everybody, and it's like a giant spider web, and you're trying to pull these pieces up nicely and try to make the user's experience as best as possible. Sometimes you just can't do that. You really can't. So what do we do and how do we fix that? Well, again, you have to stress that, remember, user A and user B, if user A is in the cloud, user B is on premise, and that is broken for some reason because of its unsupported mailbox delegation of some sort. Okay, well, that's fine. Just remember, when user B gets migrated up there, we'll just, fast track user B to get them up in the cloud so we can get that fixed again. When everybody's up in the cloud, none of that will matter anymore. Everything will be working just the way as it was before. But just in that intermediate process, when they're in between, that's all you really got to worry about. So overall aspect here, there's so many things that the hybrid configuration wizard does. It allows a seamless and easy migration aspect. There are different types of migrations. Of course, we have cutover migrations, or as I call it, dissimilar mailbox migrations. So this could be from, gosh, it's been many years since I've done one of these here, but potentially like a Novell group-wise migration, or a Lotus Notes IBM Lotus Notes Domino migration. So we're talking dissimilar from Exchange, or maybe even hosted Exchange. I've had that before, where people, like for instance, like GoDaddy or something like that, where they will have a hosted environment. Somebody else owns the Exchange environment. Their mailboxes just sit in there. Well, at that point there, you generally have to do some sort of third-party migration. That has nothing to do with what we're doing on here. I just wanted to talk about the hybrid Exchange, because this is a vast majority of the way most migrations work nowadays. So we do also have something called like a tenant-to-tenant cutover. That's completely outside the scope of what we're talking about here, though. So overall aspect, this is another piece in the overall management of a modern network here, is that we want to make this an easy migration, and it's a more, we'll say, as seamless as possible for the end user, which again, if done correctly and properly tested and vetted out, it does. It does work, and it does make the first steps into Office 365 generally a successful one, which is why in the grand scheme of moving, as we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about other aspects as this course continues on here, we'll start seeing other pieces that, we got to roll them out almost in a sequencing of events. Generally, Exchange is always the first, because it's the easiest, it's the best one to dip our toes into, and it is the easiest one from the end user's perspective. So that's typically what I'll see here as we start off with Exchange. All right, well, with that being said, I just wanted to give you a high-level overview of how a hybrid environment works and why it's important. It's very important, again, so we want to make sure, because mail is such an important system we've seen for everybody. Now, have we covered every single thing in Exchange? Absolutely not. I can do an entire course on Exchange and how it works and everything there, but again, the whole scope of this course here is to be a high-level overview. We don't get above a level 300 here. I don't like getting above, in that 400 or 500 super deep dive into it. It's just not worth it here, because again, the idea, this is supposed to be a boot camp, beginner boot camp type course. So like I said, I will have other courses that are more in depth around these services here in time, but as I said, for the scope of this course here, it is supposed to be at no more than a 300-ish level. So with that being said, thank you for attending this particular lecture here. This buttons up the last bit around Exchange and mail flow, as we were talking about from Office 365. We're going to jump into the next piece here, which is probably the most modern of the concepts, and that is the modern collaboration architecture with using Teams, OneDrive, and SharePoint. A lot of really cool stuff in that one there. We're going to have some fun in it. We only have a few more sections. However, they're going to be pretty long, each one of them there. So the Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive section, and then after that we have compliance, which is a big piece, and there's a lot of work around that one nowadays. So with that being said, thank you for attending this lecture here, and I will see you over on the next one.